Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Welcome to the weekly session on healing the heart with the Quran or Tazkiyah bil Quran. For those of you who join us regularly, you know that we're going through the 30th juz of the Quran right now, and our focus is not on the academic aspects of the exegesis or the explanation of the Quran, but more on uh, the 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 way it touches the heart and the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to his creation and invites them to connect with him. That's what we're seeking from the surahs of the Quran that we're going through. So we've been going through all of the surahs of the Juz Amma of the 30th Juz of the Quran. And last week we did Surah Az-Zalzala. So as always, inshallah, we will start with a review of what we did last time. And then inshallah, we will go into the surah that we're supposed to do today, which is Surah Al-Qariah. So let's first do a quick review of what we did last time. And that is Surah Al-Adiyat. My apologies, I said Surah Al-Zalzala. It's actually Surah Al-Adiyat. You might remember, if you were with us last week, that in Surah Al-Adiyat, we saw the relationship of a battle mare, a horse that's taken into battle, with the owner of the horse. So the battle mare's relationship with its master is kind of like a representation of someone who's dependent, their relationship with the one who they're dependent on. And that's in stark contrast with the relationship that we have with the one that we are dependent on. So the battle mare is described as ready to charge into battle to put its own life at risk for the master it is dependent on. And yet the human being is not conscious of their relationship with their master, with our master, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We think that the only form of good, as is described in the surah, is wealth, that whenever Allah is happy with someone, that means that they're rich, they have a lot of money. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that word sarcastically and says, you think that's the only form of good there is? On the Day of Judgment, though, we will become aware, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in this surah, we will become aware of the reality, and whatever's inside of our hearts will be we will be held accountable for it, just like what is outside is held accountable to this day. So in this world, for example, laws are implemented on the basis of what is visible, not on the basis of what is inside of our hearts. But on the Day of Judgment, what is inside of our hearts, whatever is inside of our hearts will be used to decide whether or not somebody did something right or wrong. So this is where showing off one's religiosity becomes a problem, because in this world you can pretend to be, mashallah, a super religious person, but on the Day of Judgment, whatever was inside the heart will be held to account. So finally, we had said that the kinds of conversations that we have with ourselves, we have to be careful about them, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears those conversations. That's a very dangerous thing, but it's also a very good thing, because just like one can have a dangerous conversation, yeah, that's right. That's why intention is important, because just like one can have a bad conversation with oneself, kind of like being mean towards others, and in a similar fashion, one can have a good conversation with oneself, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is listening. That's what we did in Surah Al-Adiyah. That's the one that we did last week. So today, inshallah, is a continuation of that, and we'll be doing Surah Al-Qariah. As we're going through this, I want us to zoom out a little bit and look at the different surahs of the Quran that and the way they're connected with each other. So here's what I want you to pay attention to. Okay, these are the past two surahs that we did, and then the surah that we're going to do today, and then inshallah the one that we'll do next week. So these are the four surahs that are in sequence, one after another. Surah number 99 of the Quran, number 100, 101, and 102. Surah 99 that we did was Surah Al-Zalzala, or the quaking of the earth, and Surah 100, which we did last week, was Surah Al-Adiyat, and then Surah Al-Qariah this week, inshallah, and Surah Al-Takathur, depending on whether we have time today or otherwise next week. I want you to see the connection between these four, because even the sequence of the surahs in the Quran is, the Arabic word is tawqifi, which means it has been laid down by the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has been given to us by the Prophet. So the sequence is supposed to have a meaning. So I'm going to go through a quick theme of each surah, and I want you to tell me whether you can see the connection between these four. Okay, first of all, We did Surah Zalzala, and what was the main theme? Whatever we see in this world, whatever we can touch, whatever we can smell, whatever we can taste, this is our reality. But that entire reality will be destroyed, and we will be held accountable for the choices that we made in this reality. That's Surah Zalzala. In Surah Al-Adiyat, which comes right after that, the theme was we are more dependent on our creator than a battle mare is dependent on its master. And yet the battle mare obeys and we disobey. And why do we disobey? Is because of the love of this current reality of what we can see and touch and feel and smell. And then Surah Al-Qariah, which we're going to do this week, we don't realize that the severity of the events of the Day of Judgment is such that when we see it in real life, when we see it happening, it will be too much for us. Nor do we appreciate that it is a part of our future. So inshallah, today we're going to go into more detail on this, but that's what Surah Al-Qariah, the main theme is. And then next week, inshallah, Surah Al-Takathur. Many of us think only about the race to the top, and really, Surah Al-Takathur is about competition, competing with the Joneses. So many of us only think about the race to the top and don't want to think about the eventual outcome of that race. Everyone will realize that eventually everyone will realize the reality when we see it with our own eyes, but by then it may be too late. So these are the 4 surahs that we're going through in sequence, and I wanted to point out the sequence so that we can put the discussion for today, Surah Al-Qariah, in context. Okay, now, Surah Al-Qariah, the phrase Al-Qariah means something striking like that, but the whole word Al-Qariah means like a disaster, a striking disaster, and obviously what's being talked about here is the Day of Judgment. The surah was revealed before the Hijrah, so it's a Meccan surah. The surahs that were revealed in Mecca, they had a lot of mention of the Day of Judgment and heaven and hell. And our mother Aisha said that the first things that were revealed, the early surahs that were revealed, they had a lot of this mention of heaven and hell, and they did not have a lot of mention of what is halal and what is haram, and this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do, because it is the mention of heaven and hell that connected people's hearts with Islam, that made them solid in Islam. It is this realization of reality that is being emphasized in these surahs. So this is one of those surahs where that's happening. And how did it affect people? It basically jolted them into realizing that every choice that I make will have an outcome, it will have an effect, and eventually I'll be held to account for it. This realization of accountability completely changed people. And we see this to this day. Even in our time today, we have people who are very careful about what they do. You and I as well, sometimes we are conscious of it, right? Oh, I better not do this and I better do this, because we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. That realization impacts us because we know that there's a heaven and hell, that there's a day of judgment where we will be held to account. I'm going to give you an example of how it affects people in the story of a man whose name was Thabit. Thabit. This is a man who lived about no more than that, about 1,000, 1,200 years before us, a Muslim. He used to live in the area around Kufa. So this Thabit one time was traveling somewhere and he was really hungry, and this is not a time where people could just stop by a shop and buy something. That was not the common thing at that time. You go and you travel and you might arrive at a town and you might find some people who are perhaps hospitable and they might host you. Otherwise, you're on your own. You either have stuff that you carry with you or you might die of starvation. Anyway, this man was traveling, and before he came to a town, he apparently came across a garden, like an orchard. And he saw a bunch of trees, and these were apparently apple trees. So without thinking about it, and this man was somebody who really feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but without thinking about it, he grabbed an apple and he ate from it. And he saw a river and he drank the water from the river and he felt a little bit better. And after he had eaten half the apple, he realized, uh-oh, I just had something that apparently belongs to someone, because that tree was not a wild tree available for the public. This was kind of an orchard. Yeah, no boundary around it, but it obviously belongs to someone. So he became worried. I mean, he's the traveler, right? And nobody's around, so he can just finish the rest of the apple and walk away. But he knows that on the day of judgment, he'll be held to account for it. So he was really concerned. He went around to look for the owner of the orchard. And eventually he found out that the owner was somebody, apparently had a house somewhere. So he went to the owner and he basically wanted to ask for the owner's forgiveness and say, for the owner to say, it's okay, you had my apple, fine. Or if you want money, I'll pay you the money and then you move on. That's what he wanted to do. So he went, he knocked on the door, and the owner said, okay, yes. And he said, well, that orchard, is that yours? So the owner said, yeah, it's mine. And he said, well, I grabbed this apple and I'm sorry. I should have asked first, but I was really hungry and I ate it and I didn't realize that it belonged to someone, and now I've had it and I know that I owe you this one. So I'm really sorry for it. I'm happy to pay or whatever. So the owner said, okay, what do you want? He said, I just want you to forgive me for this, or we settle the matter somehow. So the owner said, I will not forgive you, except on one condition. And obviously the owner recognized that this man fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the owner said, I will forgive you only on one condition. So the man said, what? He said, that you marry my daughter. So the man thought about it, and it's strange, and it's a bit of a shock, but he thought about it for a minute, and eventually he said, okay, I don't really have a choice. I mean, I'd rather just pay you for it, but I guess I don't have a choice. So the man said, okay, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more. My daughter does not see, does not hear, and does not speak. So she's deaf and she's mute and she's blind. So now the man started thinking about it and he said, oh, this is obviously, marrying someone like that is the equivalent of just taking care of them for the rest of your life. But he realized that everything depends on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has led him to this point, and whatever he's doing is obviously doing out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So on the day of judgment, he does not want to be held to account for something like this. Even though to us it might seem like something small, but the reason why this person was doing it was because he was afraid of what might happen on the day of Al-Qariah, on the day when there will be a striking disaster. So he thought about it, and I'm sure there were a lot of cold sighs, but eventually he said, yeah, okay. And then, after a few days, they were going to get married, and the people of the town were around, and I'm sure he went through a lot of sweating, but eventually he said, I had to go through with it. Got married, and then when he met the wife for the first time, you can imagine what he must be expecting. But the wife said assalamu alaikum to him, and he was surprised because it was completely not what he was expecting. And then he said, what is this? She speaks. And then she looked up and she could see him. And then she could hear him as well. And they had a conversation. And he said, but your father told me that you're mute and you're deaf and you're blind. And she said, yes, he was being metaphorical. He must have been being metaphorical because I do not speak except what is true and what is kind, and I do not listen to people's gossip, and I don't listen to rubbish, and I only listen to that which is good. Otherwise, I try not to listen. And similarly, something about the eyes as well. I only put my eyes, or I only glance upon something that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is what Allah's allowed. So then this man realized, oh, so my father-in-law played a trick on me, and he kind of tested me with this. Anyway, obviously, he was a good man, and this was a good family, and the wife was a good person as well. So they got married, and eventually they had a child, and the child grew up. Remember, I told you this man's name was Thabit. They named the son Nu'man. So the man grew up to become a very wealthy trader and a scholar of Islam. His name was Nu'man bin Thabit, rahmatullah alayhi. And he's the man that you and I know as Imam Abu Hanifa, and I'm sure you've heard his name. So Imam Abu Hanifa, this is the story of his parents. The reason why I started this story is because it was his parents who were both very conscious of Al-Qariah. They were conscious of the Day of Judgment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought these two people who were so careful about the choices that they made in this world, brought them together. And from them and their upbringing came to us a man as great as Imam Abu Hanifa. Now let's talk about what Al-Qari'ah is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Al-Qari'ah, the striking disaster. Mal-Qari'ah, what is the striking disaster? Now, Allah is having a conversation with us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the striking disaster and says, what is the striking disaster? And then challenges us and says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْقَارِعَةُ, and what will make you realize what the striking disaster is? I mean, um, we think we understand what's going to happen on the day of judgment, but this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenging us, saying, yeah, you can come up with your own perception, your own description in words, or you can draw it however you want, or you can make a movie out of it. You can animate it however you want, but you will not fully appreciate what this striking disaster is. Whatever you can think of, it's more severe than that. Now, why is it severe for us? Because Allah describes an-nas. An-nas means people in general, Muslims, non-Muslims, everyone. So, يَوْمَ يَكُونُ النَّاسُ كَالْفَرَاشِ الْمَبْثُوثِ. It is the day on which people will be like scattered moths. And if you have seen scattered moths in the morning after they've been moving around light at night, if you've seen that, you will understand what that scene will be like. Just kind of spread out, almost having been beaten into a pulp, but scattered around like that. وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ الْمَنْفُوشِ. And the mountains will be like carded wool. Mountains which we see as the sign of strength and power. These mountains will turn to dust. One of my chemistry teachers, and by the way, whatever I'm going to share right now is just one guy's opinion. So this is just to explain to you how something strong like a stone or a rock turns into carded wool. He used to say that the strongest bond in the world is, or in the universe, is the hydrogen bond, which is what keeps water together, for example. And he said that if, let's say, Allah decides that that bond disappears between two molecules, it just disappears, everything will become like very soft dust. It will just become almost like carded wool. I'm just sharing that example to demonstrate that doing something like that is not difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abdullah bin Mas'ud, he used to spend a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ told him to recite to him. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, I recite to you? And he said, yes. So he recited Surah An-Nisa. And the Prophet ﷺ was listening to him. And then when he reached a certain verse, told him to stop. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud looked up and the Prophet ﷺ was crying. And it is the verse about this day, about the day of judgment. That's how it affected the Prophet ﷺ. And when he would pray, sometimes the Sahaba used to say that when the Prophet ﷺ would pray at night, we would hear his breath as if, you see the water boil, you hear the boiling of the water. That's because of the way he was crying. Why did the Prophet ﷺ cry? And why is it that we are also encouraged to cry? And even if you don't feel like crying, try to force yourself to cry. Why? Because it is worth crying, and it is a hope that these tears will eventually extinguish the fire, and it will give us calmness and serenity on that day, on this day of judgment. So what will happen on that day? I mean, how will people be? There are two types or two categories of people. فَأَمَّا مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. So as for those whose scale is heavy with good deeds, people who've been trying, who've been working hard, who've been looking for every opportunity, who whenever a choice is presented to them, they're conscious of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from them. And they make their choice on that basis. Their scale will, of course, on that day be heavy. It's because it's hard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes it is not easy. Going through this life is not easy. We come across all kinds of challenges, but this is the reward. On that day, that scale will be heavy. فَأَمَّا مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَهُوَ فِي عِيشَةٍ رَاضِيَةٍ. They will be in a life of bliss. They will be calm and comfortable. I've mentioned this before. It'll be a day that'll be like 50,000 years for most people, but there'll be, for some people, this day will be like the time between Asr and Maghrib. Because, when you're happy, when you're expecting something good, inshallah, may Allah make us among them, among those people who are looking forward to go to Jannah, it'll be almost like, all right, let's get through this. I'm excited about this. And time passes very quickly. But then the other category is also talked about, which is وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. And as for those whose scale is light, meaning they did not put in the effort and they kind of took it easy when it came to doing things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, their scale will be light. فَأُمُّهُ هَاوِيَةٌ. I wish I could communicate what the Arabic says here, but I will try. Ummuhu hawiya means, in Arabic, generally, when you want to say that somebody's place is their mother's lap, or this is the place they deserve, you say that place is like their mother's lap. For ummuhu hawiya, that means their mother's lap is like, it is the abyss. That's what it says. And the translator has translated this as their home will be the abyss. That will be their abode. That's shocking. And many people, when they go through these verses of the Quran, they say, why is it that the Quran is so full of sorrow or such difficult things? Look, the Quran is also filled with hope. And there are times when the Quran warns. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not warn us out of his affection for us, then we will end up in this category. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from being among them. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna hadha al-Qur'ana, this Quran was revealed with sorrow. So when you recite it, then weep. And if you cannot weep, then pretend to weep, as I just mentioned. The surah continues, and here's how this ends. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا هِيَ. Now, we were talking about the place, the final abode of the people whose scale will be light. May Allah not make us among them. So, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا هِيَ, and what will make you realize what that is? What will you, how will you ever appreciate what that is? Narun Hamia. It is a scorching fire. The impact that this had on people and the kinds of dua that they used to make. I'm going to tell you guys another very quick story. Now, this is a weak narration. What I'm going to share right now is a weak narration. And whenever we share the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it falls into different categories. When it's a matter of aqidah, belief, then we have to take the strongest ones. Absolutely. And when it comes to matters of fiqh, for example, halal and haram, then we can go down one level of authenticity. And then when it comes to matters of seerah, for example, then it goes down another level of authenticity. And then it comes to matters of, for example, taking lessons for one's life or matters of the heart, then we can go another level down in authenticity. So the narration that I'm going to share with you is a weak narration, but the lesson that it gives is still authentic. So that's why I'm sharing this narration with you. It's the story of a man whose name was Tha'laba. This man, apparently, according to this narration, was a man from the Ansar, and he became a Muslim, and he used to serve the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ sent him on an errand to go do something. So he was going, and on his way, he passed by someone's house. And as you know, it is not permissible for us to stare inside people's houses. Muslims don't do that. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ used to get very angry with people who used to do things like that. Anyway, and this is the time, by the way, when they didn't have big gates and doors either. So this man was walking and he saw somebody's house. And it was people from his own city, and he was walking by and he was kind of looking around. He looked inside a house, and at that time the wind blew, and he apparently saw a lady in that house, and she was not dressed properly. So he saw, and he kind of looked, and he looked more than once. Instead of just turning his face away, he looked more than once. Anyway, he did something that wasn't right. He was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. So he was as soon as he realized what he had done, he was so scared that he kind of ran away and he disappeared. And the Prophet ﷺ waited for him, but he didn't come back. So many days passed. The Prophet ﷺ missed him. And this man went into the hills around Medina. Many days passed, and Jibreel alayhi salam came down to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, your Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, conveys salam to you. The man from your ummah who has fled is in these mountains, and he's seeking refuge from Allah from his fire. The Prophet ﷺ said, then called Umar ibn al-Khattab and Salman al-Farisi, and he said, go and bring Tha'laba. So they went out, and while they were still in the streets of Medina, they met one of the shepherds who was coming from the mountains. And they asked him if he knew anything about a man who was in these hills. So they said, perhaps you're looking for the men, or for the one who's fleeing from hell. So Umar ibn Khattab said, well, how do you know that? How do you know he's fleeing from hell? He said, because in the middle of the night, he comes out to us and he, he just grabs his head like this and saying, and he's kind of making dua to Allah, oh Allah, would that you took my soul as you took other souls, and my body as you took other bodies, and not expose me on the day of judgment. It was his fear of what will happen on the day of judgment that had driven him like that. And he was seeking forgiveness and he didn't know how. So Umar ibn Khattab said, yes, that's the one. That's the guy we're looking for. So the shepherd went out with them. And then this is the middle of the night now. So they came upon him in the hills. They found him eventually. And he was still holding his head and he was still making the same dua, oh Allah, would that you took my soul and took other souls and my body as you took other bodies and not expose me on the day of judgment. Umar ibn Khattab went to him and kind of held him tight and said, Thalaba said to him, I want to be safe from the fire. Meaning, you are holding me. Yeah, I know you care, but I want to be safe from the fire and you can't do anything about it. Umar ibn Khattab said to him, I am Umar. And he said, oh Umar, does the Prophet ﷺ know of my sin? And Umar ibn Khattab said, all I know is that he remembered you yesterday. And the Prophet ﷺ cried. Thalaba said, oh Umar, do not let me enter upon him, meaning make it such that I don't come upon the Prophet ﷺ unless that he's praying. And just at the time when he's starting the prayer, so Bilal, for example, is saying, قَدْ قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةُ قَدْ قَامَتِ الصَّلَاةُ, at that time is when I want to arrive. So Umar said, fine. So they had to carry him back because he was so weak. So they brought him back to Medina. They arrived, and the Prophet ﷺ was leading the prayer of Fajr. So Umar and Salman, they left Tha'laba there, and they went to join the row of worshippers. And the Prophet ﷺ started his recitation, and Tha'laba, in the meanwhile, became unconscious. So after the Prophet ﷺ finished the prayer, he said, oh Umar, oh Salman, what happened to Tha'laba? So they said, he's over there, Ya Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The Prophet ﷺ stood up and said, oh Tha'laba. And he said, Labbaik Ya Rasulullah. He looked at him and said, what kept you away from me? He said, my sin, O Prophet. And he said, shall I not tell you about a verse that will expiate sins and errors? And he said, yes, O Rasulullah. This is the reason, by the way, I'm telling you the story. Because the dua that comes from a verse of the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ is telling Tha'laba is, like I said, it's in the Quran. And inshallah, I'll share that with you in the slides as well in a moment. And it's one that is well known. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, here, this is a verse. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Our Lord, give us in this world that is good, and in the hereafter that which is good, and save us from the torment of the fire. So the Prophet is saying is, you make this dua sincerely, then it expiates one's sins. It brings one closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously you do that out of your concern. So, but he said, no, but my sin is too great. And the Prophet said, no, the word of Allah is greater than your sin. Then the Prophet told him to go home. He became very sick. And after a week or so, one of the Sahaba, it was Salman al-Farisi, who told the Prophet that he's really sick, Ya Rasulullah. So the Prophet went to see him. And the Prophet was talking to him, and he was still feeling very concerned about his sin. So Jibreel came to the Prophet and said, your Lord says salam to you, and says, if this slave of mine, meaning Tha'laba, were to meet me with an entire earth full of sins, I would meet him with the same amount of forgiveness. And the Prophet ﷺ then told Tha'laba about that. And Tha'laba was obviously very pleased, and he felt such that he gave a shout, and then he passed away at that time. The Prophet ﷺ then told the Sahaba, they washed him and shrouded him, and the Prophet ﷺ offered the janazah prayer for him. Now, interestingly, when the Prophet ﷺ, after the janazah prayer, during the janazah prayer and after the janazah prayer, when the Prophet ﷺ was walking, he was walking on his tiptoes. And obviously he could see something that the Sahaba couldn't see. So the Sahaba asked, why are you walking on your tiptoes? And the Sahaba used to ask whenever they saw the Prophet ﷺ doing something, thinking maybe this is sunnah. But he said, by the one who sent me with the truth as a prophet, I could not put my feet on the ground because of the many wings of the angels who came down to accompany this man's funeral procession. That is the story of Tha'laba, who was really conscious of his actions and feared what will happen on the day of judgment. It is important, my brothers and sisters, that we draw this lesson in our lives as well, because each of us has our own individual relationship with our Creator. Each of us will come on the day of judgment alone. Farda, Yawm al-Qiyamati farda. Each of us will come on that day alone, and we will each be responsible for our own deeds alone, not our parents, not our country, not our tribe. No one will be held responsible for what we do except us, individually responsible for this on the day of judgment. Now, Allah gives us two options. فَأَمَّا مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. It is possible that on that day, our scale will be heavy with good deeds. And that is basically the effort, not the outcome. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards effort. You try and your scale becomes heavy. You try more and your scale becomes heavy. And the one who doesn't try and doesn't care, obviously then the scale is light, and we don't want to end up like that. Now, I promised you that I would share with you the dua that I had just mentioned. This is the dua that especially people in our region, we learn it whenever we're learning the prayer. This is the dua that generally we make right before we say the salam, but even otherwise, it's a good dua to make on a regular basis. And the dua goes like this: رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. This is verse 201 in Surah Al-Baqarah. O Lord, our Lord, grant us the good of this world and the hereafter, and protect us from the torment of the fire. And who else would we ask to protect us from the torment of the fire? Here are some lessons that we took from today from Surah Al-Qariah. This is Surah Al-Qariah. Remember what I said about it, that this is just the, and you guys can, I'm out of time, so the lessons you can read afterwards. But as I was making the point, Surah Al-Qariah, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the entire sequence of the Quran, comes right before Surah Al-Takathur. The Day of Judgment is supposed to be a reminder for those of us who want to compete. Everyone is competitive. It's natural to want to compete. But what are we going to compete over? Are we going to compete over having more and more and more in this world? That's what Surah Al-Takathur is about. Or are we going to compete over having the heaviest scale on the Day of Judgment? It's a simple lesson. Many of the surahs of the Quran also describe it. But really, in the end, what matters is whether we take this lesson to heart and put it into action. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among those who actually put this into action. Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, I will see you guys next week on Saturday. And by the way, here's the homework. And my suggestion is, in your nafil prayers, try to recite Surah Al-Qariah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.